Metro Louisville is made up of 26 districts. This podcast gives you a chance to connect with your council member and learn about what's going down in your district. Welcome everyone to District Download. I'm Katrina Helmer, and we have a part 2. So as it was so succinctly suggested earlier before we hit record, if you're confused as to who the two people are that are about to start talking, go on over to episode number 5 to hear part 1 first. Joining me, I have Councilmen Piagentini Arthur and Councilman Anthony Piagentini. Thank you for coming back to the table. I am excited for this episode, so welcome.
Thank you very much.
But I also know we are going to have quite the job of keeping everyone on time, which is something we learned from episode number 1. So I'm going to quiet up real quick here and just hand it over to you guys because we're launching into equity part 2. Probably the biggest topic I could think of for the first time around. So what do we have left for the second time around?
We're about to have some rapid fire. We'll just ask each other questions. I know last episode we talked about a lot of like grand ideas and really, I think, stayed away from like specific local issues. Of course, things at the national level trickle down to local, but I want to talk about, local issues specifically around our economy, around violence, around housing, and just ask each other questions on our opinions on policies and ideas and how we address some of the issues that we're dealing with here in Louisville. You got any other goals?
No, that's exactly what I did. Because we outlined...
I feel like I need a bell that goes like ding, ding, ding. Okay, start.
Well, because we outlined economy, violence, housing as we were sort of heading up to this, and that's what I did. All my questions are more related to like here, now. What can we do? What are the things that we debate related to these topics? So, I didn't know where you have a few more questions than I do. So why don't you start, Corey?
So my first question is around wages. So as we talk about the economy, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, aka MIS, created this living wage calculator. And it fluctuates depending on, what the economy is looking like. But in general, it says that in Jefferson County, an adult with 0 children should be making at least 16 and some change an hour. Do you believe every business, private and or public, should be paying a living wage? Why or why not?
Do you mean when you say, do I believe they should be paying it? Do you, like as a matter of public policy or just should they pay it?
Should they pay it? Mandating them to pay it, I think, is a different conversation. But should they pay it first? And again, that's 16 and some change.
My short answer is probably going to be no, because what they should be paying is the market rate, right? Because it's not as easy as to say, so for example, right, my kids are close to getting to the age where they can start applying for part-time work, right? Right now they're just babysitting and that type of thing. They would fall into every definition you just met, right? When they're college students, they will fall into that definition. Now they will actually be an adult, right? And they'll still fall into that definition. But I'm saving up for their college tuition, right? So in reality, which includes room and board, by the way, so they will have almost no actual needs other than spending money, books, right? Like things that a couple thousand a year, they could probably live off that just fine. So it's impossible for us to break all the way down. Like, okay, an adult, what do they actually need? Like I know a lot of adults that take incredibly low-paying jobs for no other reason that they have a passion for that industry, like teaching assistants. My mother was a union public school teacher, but teaching assistants make a fraction of what teachers make. Most of them, some of them were wealthy, were quite very well off, didn't need the income. They did it because they were passionate about it. So there was a market rate that said, okay, well, very low-skilled work. They didn't have to go to college. They didn't need a degree. They didn't need these things. Okay, this was the rate. Now, with that said, I want everybody to make as much money as they humanly possibly can. So, and I think companies are ignorant, and frankly, the free market, I think, would manage them out of business if they didn't pay the best wage they can for the best labor. And I have seen that play out with companies that I've worked for, where if they start to get cheap, now it takes more than a few months, it takes a little while to play out, but the market very quickly, particularly in more modern economies. Now, if you're talking 100 years ago, if you're talking 150 years ago, the economy was very different. But in this economy, particularly the gig economy, people have so many options, so many different ways to make money. Businesses are clamoring for labor. I mean, that's most of the reason why labor rates have gone up. So no, do I think they have to work? Do a company have to think, oh, should I pay $16 an hour? No, other than they must think about that. If they expect somebody to work full time and they don't pay it, then they got to worry about that person leaving 2 seconds later as soon as they can find a job paying $17 an hour or 18 and 19. So no, but it would be quite ignorant for a company who is expecting somebody to work full time and live off of that to pay less than that. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Am I next, or
let's get it?
Okay. Well, wait a minute. I want to hear your opinion on that, though. So, what's your thoughts?
If we answer our own questions, we'll be here all night.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So maybe pick one each.
Yeah. Okay. Then let me do this one. So, related to the economy, particularly locally, I would love to hear your opinions about TIF financing for business growth. Right. So, just to help people out a little bit, different businesses, there's all kinds of incentives that. And when I say TIF, Corey, I'm talking about both. We do it mostly for property tax, but there's which is usually an 80-20, right? So the 80% rebates to the business, the 20% incremental over baseline with caps and limits, but nonetheless, it's there. They get a rebate, or they get it back if they hit certain milestones. And we also have ones that we do for businesses that are doing certain job growth related to occupational tax. We give 1%, the state will give another 1% or 1.5%, whatever it is. So I'm curious about your thoughts about, essentially giving these companies a break on taxes in order to, if they hit milestones, and is that a reasonable thing the government should be doing to grow jobs and grow opportunity?
No public dollars if there are no public benefits. That's my rule, and that's how I legislate. I don't care if it's someone asking for a TIF for a hotel, for an apartment complex, for anything. If there aren't public benefits that go along with that, then I would not be supportive of it. And that's what I've stuck to since I've been in office. Now, with that being said, I did not know before we started doing some of these community benefits agreements that in the past, when some were agreed to, whether it was, my predecessor or her predecessor, or whoever, they weren't legally binding. So it might have been a handshake deal like the Omni. We'll have a grocery store. That sounds great until you walk into that grocery store and realize you can't afford anything in there or get something fresh that you need and you could get from like a Kroger. So what I've always practiced and I've always preached is that if we're going to give them any sort of incentive, they need to give the residents an incentive, because those public dollars are essentially supposed to be used for their public good, but in this case, it's going to go to a private corporation. And some examples of those benefits have included something in Smoketown. Shout out to Smoketown neighborhood in District 4. They wanted to make sure that the business identified as a Smoketown business and was proud to be a Smoketown business, not Greater Germantown, not South Nulu, identified as a Smoketown business, because erasure of neighborhoods and identity is so real and so harmful. We've had businesses on that minimum wage conversation, livable wage conversation, who have committed to, legally binding, committed to making sure they were paying a wage floor so that everyone there was making 15, 16 plus, no matter what. We've had businesses commit to a community space for people in that neighborhood to have access to every month for free of charge, and have staff support. So those community benefits are just some examples. There have been more that we've worked on, but my opinion is that if you're going to give public dollars to someone, you should always have a public benefit.
Okay, quick follow up.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad my question was going to be what's the define public benefit. So you did that, but let me play out a scenario. So first of all, the wage floor thing, most of the incentives require wage floors. So just so the public knows, most of them, there is a version where if you go below that, you still get a small percent. But the max TIF, you have to pay above a certain wage. So with that said, let's just say a company says, hey, let's pick on Smoketown, right? Because good. And a business says, hey, look, I want to open up at Smoketown. I'm going to create 200 permanent jobs. And let's just say they're going to be above the $16, let's say $20 an hour, $25 an hour jobs, right? So they're good jobs. But frankly, if you make me sign a community benefits agreement, I'm not opening. What would you think about it?
I work for my constituents, not the developer, not the corporation, not the investor. They don't vote for me and put me in office. My constituents do. So I'm gonna go with what my constituents want. But I'll also say this: having consensus and doing what's populist is important. But at the same time, you also have to have some value in that, some morals in that. So just because it's popular doesn't mean I'll believe it to be just and right. So if I had everybody in a specific neighborhood or in the district say, you know what, we should go on a rampage and start killing people. If that was popular, I would still have to stand up and say, actually, absolutely not, even if it cost me not being reelected again. So on one end, being a leader includes being able to come to a consensus, but it also means molding consensus and building consensus. Because in some cases, if you knew better, you do better. And we don't always know everything we need to know going into these situations policy-wise.
Yeah, a lot of agreement. Okay, thanks.
So sticking with the economy, I have something that's more specific to racial inequity. At every income level, at every job, at every educational attainment level, we're looking at disparities in pay between Black Louisvillians and their white counterparts. Why do you think that is? How do we solve it?
So, one of the bonus question I had was about equity of opportunity versus equity of outcome, right? The wage is outcome, right? It's not whether or not you had the opportunity to go to school or opportunity to get that job. It's that you got that wage, right? So if we're using that as an outcome measurement, I don't see, and there's a lot of data that will show this, right, that just because there is a disproportionality in outcome, it means there is a structural problem or not, right? For example, right, there are subgroups of racial demographics within and prior nationality demographics within America that are crushing native-born, Northern European, immigrated, white Caucasian Americans. And not just, and people will automatically default to Asian, and that's not true. There's actually subcategory of African immigrants, right, and other groups, right, but they're you have to break it down in a very detailed way. Mm-hmm. So now, what I don't like to believe what the problem is. I want the data to show me what the problem is, right? So unfortunately, it takes some fairly sophisticated economic analysis, but there are some economists that have looked at these types of things. So we would need somebody at U of L to look at it specifically for Louisville. I've read national studies, right? And actually, one of the things when we get into violence, but I was going to bring up something related to this, but I'm not going to get too far ahead. But for me, the question is, okay, number one, what's the multivariable analysis on this, mm-hmm. right? So yes, at the same educational attainment, but what else is going on, mm-hmm. right? Did both those people, just because we're talking black and white, let's talk Caucasian, African American, right? Did both of them come from a two-parent household? Mm-hmm. Did both of them come from a similar socioeconomic background, which might have given them access to certain other business owners or people that might have helped them get some early jobs? What did the resumes look like leading up to that job, right? So in that, I've hired people that were managers, and I hired one manager at one pay rate and one at another pay rate because the one came with 15 years experience, the one that was the first time being a manager, right? Mm-hmm. So they were worth that much more because of their experience. So we'd have to net all that out. Now, once you net all that out and you're still left with race, right, and you're still left with the only variable being race, now you have proof of systemic racism, mm-hmm. right? So it's got to be a much more complicated analysis. This is the same thing with the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap discussion drives me crazy because the way it is calculated is they take the total wages of all women, the total wages of all men, and divide it by the total men and the total women in the United States. That is the worst possible way you could run that number, because my wife, for example, who has the same education attainment and I, we both have master's degrees, right? And here's a perfect example. She's also African-American and I'm Caucasian, right? So if you were to look at these numbers by themselves, she makes a tiny fraction of what I make per hour. At the same educational attainment, similar work history, right, as far as she's worked for the same amount of years as I have and all of this. Our kids are adopted. She didn't even have to take off time technically for pregnancy. She actually went to work almost immediately after our kids were born, right? So we got help at home and all this. So she didn't have the most common reason women have any pay gap is related to that time they're having children, because it happens right at the time when most people are moving up very quickly in their careers. So you have to take all that out. And if you're looking at the numbers between my wife and I, it would look like there's some problem here, a racial or a gender problem, but there isn't. And she has everything, half of hers anyway, right? If she, God forbid it never happens, but she's got half the wealth that this family has generated, right? So we would have to do the multivariable analysis first. But if after all that, and there have been circumstances, it can be racism, right? But we have to take all that out first. So, and then we have to address those variables too, right? That's where, for me, the equity of opportunity becomes such a high priority, particularly around education, particularly around access to jobs, right? There's a real thing about where you grow up geographically, right? If you're growing up in the West End versus the East End here in the city, for example, you just have access to different jobs, different networks, right? That's not fair, right? What the hell's fair about that, right? So the more we can address those variables, we may find out it's not race at all. It's actually a completely other problem. So I don't know 100% what it is here in Louisville. I've never seen the specific analysis here. We should do it so that we're attacking the right problem.
All right, I expect co-sponsorship when we look at that here locally.
What do you mean? You're going
an analysis?
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Let's get into violence. So my question is kind of just like, and you might have some actual like factual information behind this, but I'm just curious because it's a conversation that I've had that I never really understood. We've asked people who've come to committees and we've never really understood why this is the case. But for a chunk of this year, we know that we've had higher percentages of homicides and lower percentages of shootings compared to last calendar year. Why do you think that is?
Well, so we asked that question. It's domestic violence is the problem. So what this is going to sound really terrible, but it's the truth. The way if you're involved in gang or group related activity, right, which has been a big focus, GVI, that whole program, the group violence initiative, and all this stuff. Generally speaking, there's a lot of bullets that fly to kill one person. In a domestic violence situation, when typically it's a husband and wife, but whether it's husband and wife or a father and a son or whatever it is, right? One shot, that person's dead, right? Because you're at point blank range. Generally, you have an intimate relationship. So I do know why I asked that specific question, and particularly in the first half of the year, we were up to 40% reduction in shootings, but the homicide rate was, and right now, I just saw the weekly report, we're down 33% in shootings, down 10% in homicides. It's actually starting to equalize a little bit, like it's getting closer. The difference earlier in the year was even worse. It was like 40% to a 0% difference, and that was related to early in the year. There was this big spat of domestic violence homicides. And so I know, Councilwoman Chambers Armstrong has made, really led the way, along with Councilwoman McCraney on the whole women's initiative and all these things and looking at issues related to women. The domestic violence thing, it has to be a huge conversation. Largely domestic violence is male and female violence. Let's just call it like it is. And I'm actually interested in pursuing I'll just broadly call it Fathers and Families Initiative, because what we see a couple things going on. an increase in domestic violence, which tells me that whether they're fathers or they're not, but men in intimate relationships are obviously overly violent, right? Or at least too many of them. We want to get to zero, but the incidences have increased. On the flip side of that, we see very much this big spike in juvenile violence. And one of the most common denominators, and this is true in school shootings, right, is a lack of a father in the household or a lack of a male influence, right? And I mean like an intimate male influence. So whether that's a father or if the father is not there, you find another strong, good, positive male influence. It's a huge, huge problem. And not just amongst young boys either. In young boys, it manifests itself in usually being unable to direct violent tendencies or aggression, right? Fathers typically get them into sports and get them constructive ways to deal with that. It affects young girls. There's been books written about the impact of the lack of fathers on young girls, which usually manifests itself in the increased desire for male intimacy and not necessarily productive male intimacy. So, but yeah, that's why domestic violence has been crushing it. Speaking of violence, I'm curious from you, and I know, I think we've talked about this for not in the last podcast, but just off the record a few times. But for me, violence is it's an outcome, right? So there's all these things leading up to it. Would love to hear your thoughts on what are the key drivers, right? And I listed a few, right? It could be education, could be jobs, could be poverty, could be all these other things, right? What in your research and experience do you think are the greatest drivers of violent behavior?
Well, you really just said the heart of it, which based on my experience and my expertise would be a lack of a community. And that means a community within your household, a village, a community outside of your household, a support system. And, this goes into jobs, lack of knowledge and understanding about access to jobs. I just talked to a brother the other day. I was out walking, and he was saying there's no jobs out here for him because he had a record. And I connected him with the Career Center, the Kentuckiana Career Center, and showed him a whole list of jobs he could get, but he just did not know because surrounding him, he did not have that community of support to put him in the know, and he didn't know where to look. That's for him. For a young kid, it might be, hey, there's nothing for us to do. Actually, if you go to the Louisville Free Public Library, there's hundreds of events every single month. There's all sorts of activities and clubs you can get involved in. People don't know about 211, and it sounds simple, but I'm in a room full of people, and I ask, have you heard of 911? Every hand goes up. 311, about half the hands go up. 211, maybe 2 hands go up. And that's important. When you have that sense of community, you can inform people. And I believe when you have a more informed people, we create community, and a community you can rely on for all of that, whether it's, mutual aid, where you bring together resources and you help people, you borrow things, you barter things. You're informing people about where the jobs are. You're informing people about where they can go to get city resources. There are a lot of resources in this city. We just don't always do the best job at advertising those and letting people know about them. So I think when it comes to violence, and this, of course, means physical violence, but also economic violence and every other form of violence, I wholeheartedly condemn it. And to address it, we need to make sure that we address neglect. We make sure that we build communities. And in some cases, that community might mean literally building, large swaths of communities that don't have access to fresh and healthy food. So we need to build them a grocery store, or building a sense of community socially, where they have that adult in their life that is influencing them and telling them about the resources that exist, or just telling them about mistakes they made and making sure they don't go down that same path. I'll never forget Nairi Clayton Taylor, one of the Kentucky Teachers of the Year. She was talking about her program, where she's teaching kids about how to marry hip hop and social justice. And she said very candidly, if we aren't making programs for our kids, sometimes they might make their own programs. And those programs might be a life of violence and a life of crime. So I wholeheartedly believe to address the violence within the community, you have to create a community itself of support.
Yeah. I would just say that what she was getting at was the old adage, idle hands make for the devil's playground, right? I mean, it's probably an overused phrase, but particularly amongst youth. I mean, I saw this when I was in the Marine Corps. I got to tell you, the worst thing that could ever happen when you had a bunch of particularly male Marines sitting around, if they didn't have anything to do, it was about to be very bad, right? Because to your point, they'll make up stuff to do, and when they made it up, it was never a good thing. So, yeah, right. So they needed... And look, most of them were young men. I mean, most of the guys that I served with, I was old when I went in. I was 24. Everybody else, 18 to 20, right? I mean, it barely paid a rent at that point, right? And most of them hadn't. They just went right out of high school and went into the Corps and, been loose to call them men at that point, other than the fact that they were handed rifles, right? But anyway.
And community really creates not only strength socially, economically and whatnot, but also politically, because then we're addressing policy needs. I might have a neighborhood that's disenfranchised, and oftentimes I'm seeking their input on the decisions that I make at City Hall. But if the community is already organized, the community is already on the same page about their wants and their needs and their concerns, I'm in a place where now I can just amplify that in City Hall and use that to change their life on a larger scale outside of what individuals can do for them.
Just as a follow-up, because we're sticking to the specific questions, how far would you go policy-wise to fix a broken community?
I think that we go as far as possible and even beyond that. And when you look at my community, we can talk about Russell, where I proudly live, just west of downtown. There are so many issues within Russell that were imposed on the neighborhood, on the people, by government. So government should do everything that they can to reverse it, and then some. And you have to also keep in mind, and you touched on this, leading up to the outcome, there are all of these different factors that play a role in what that outcome is. Unfortunately, that outcome for some folks is death. So how do we unpack, analyze every part of that community and every issue in that community and say, what do we need to do to address it? What role do we play in bringing, this reality upon these people? So as far as what we need to do, we go as far as we can. But on the flip side to that, and I say this all the time, policy, legislation is only as powerful as people make it. You have to pick it up and you have to use it. When people come to me about shootings and homicides, I, of course, know that there could always be more resources. There could also be more connection of community. But they don't like when I say to them, it's already illegal to shoot somebody. It's already illegal to kill somebody. So we can ban homicides and shooting people all day long, but if you don't actually follow that, regardless of every single thing that led to that outcome, if you don't follow that, me passing legislation might as well be useless. And I'm using extreme examples of homicides and shootings, but it could be extending the community center hours, which we have done and passed the money through the budget to do that. But if you don't go to that community center, if you don't go to that library and take advantage of that programming, what was the point of us doing it? And then also you don't realize it does harm because it can be taken away if we don't utilize it. I think our last subject was around housing. And then I got just a big question about this Metro Review Commission we're on.
I got a side eye. You do have time for this last topic, so go ahead. I grant this time. Go for it.
I had one question, but why don't you start and then I'll hit you with mine.
So housing, I got a whole bunch of housing questions, but I'll stick with this. A stigma for public housing, for affordable housing, is that it's of low quality. But when you look at places, I'll use Europe as an example. There are so many European countries that do public housing really well. They call it social housing. And we're talking about just architecturally beautiful housing, comfortable housing, sustainable housing. Why do you think in the United States of America, zoom in Louisville, Kentucky, why are we failing at that? And I also just add in, we have some of the best public libraries in the entire country. I don't know if you knew that. We got rated some of the best public parks, some of the best public schools as well. I believe that housing, we should have some of the best public housing as well. Unfortunately, though, we do not. Why do you think that is, and what can we do about it?
My question is very close to this, so this is good. We're on somewhat of the same note here. Part of it is there is a huge difference in tax rates in particularly Western European countries, right? So if you look at France, Spain, Portugal, these are highly, and I'm not creating a boogeyman here, but they're more social in the political spectrum. They lean more socialist, right? So they're comfortable with, their populace is comfortable with a far more active role of the government in things like housing. So their tax rates are way higher than ours are, right? So private income, if you got a job, as much as we complain about the feds, particularly if you're in the top income bracket, we have this weird progressive system. You're averaging around 25% taxes, right? If you're in an upper middle income tax bracket. In Europe, it's much closer to 40%, right? Maybe even higher in some countries. And they believe that's a trade-off. In America, we just straight up don't, right? I mean, part of the issue is America has not embraced an idea that housing is a right. We believe in certain rights. Housing has never been one of them. To some degree, food access up until recent years, right, with the real expansion of the school lunch programs, and now it's like school almost breakfast, lunch, and dinner programs. Mm-hmm. So school funding of food and all this stuff. I would argue, 30 years ago, right, food wasn't a right, right? Mm-hmm. And we're about as close as we can get right now with food. So Americans have just never embraced that idea. The other thing is, and this, I'm a bit burned by this myself. I grew up in New Jersey. The New York City public housing projects, particularly of the 60s, 70s, which then started getting broken down and torn down in like the 80s and 90s because the government was just doing an incredibly bad job of managing it. There was corruption involved. There was all kinds of crazy stuff going on, right? Kickbacks, right? I mean, real, true corruption, government corruption. So I think people have a really bad taste in their mouth, and I know I do, bluntly, about that. So I have my initial reaction: government getting more involved in housing, right? Even locally, we were debating one of these ordinances related to rental housing, and the truth of the matter is, the Louisville Metro Housing Authority is one of the worst related to violations, right? Mm-hmm. And so now they're making some changes, and that's good, and we're holding them to account, but. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But I think that's probably most of it, right? I don't see there being I don't know of any other reasons that we would do it significantly differently. And frankly, my question is about what is the right balance and ratio, right? Because I will tell you locally, I saw, the elevation, right? So the design of an upcoming affordable housing complex, they were talking granite countertops and all this other stuff. And I was like, well, that's great, but how many less, we have a finite amount of dollars we're dedicating to housing. So from your point of view, what is the threshold of, we want to have good, I don't want anybody to live in a place that that I wouldn't step foot in. Mm-hmm. Okay. But I've also lived in a basement apartment in the Bronx, right? There was nothing glamorous about that place, right? And so what is the threshold in public housing so that we can build more of it?
You mentioned America and making housing a right, which is something I wholeheartedly believe in. And I don't know what it'll take to move us there unless we have mass uprising. And not just from people who are unhoused or insecure with housing, but this impacts people who are in housing and who have comfortable, sustainable, affordable housing for themselves. This is an issue that's going to impact everyone in this country. And I think it's going to get much worse, especially as we talk about inflation and rent just going crazy out of control. But to respond to your question, the balance between, I guess, affordability and comfortability, is that a word?
We're making it a word.
Or maybe like quality versus volume, right? You can have less units for better quality or more units for less quality, right? Like, where's that balance from your point of view?
I think quality should have majority. And I say that just thinking about long term, how, housing deteriorates over time. Would we be paying more in the long run if, we're making a bunch of units up front and they're not as up to code, versus we do it right now, and then later on we don't need to deal with the consequences of that. I read a report from the University of Louisville. Someone did a dissertation on accessible housing and how it costs so much more to make housing accessible years down the line compared to just making sure it's accessible now. So I would champion quality over quantity. And then, of course, we need to invest more resources in making sure that the quantity is where it needs to be. It's going to be a long time, and local government will never close the housing gap. State government can never close the housing gap. We need every level of government invested in making sure housing is a human right for folks.
Yeah, the only thing, just as another comment on the housing quantity issue, I stopped arguing with him because I didn't want to go too far, and we would need to break out all the original reports. But like right now, we have the numbers that we've been quoting, right? We're down 30,000 units for this percentage of AMI. I'm not sure I believe that. And we definitely have a housing shortage. I do believe that. I think the data is very clear on that, right? But when we throw out numbers 30,000, there's assumptions, and one of the mistakes that was made in at least one part of the study, and I read the whole report and I threw it to an economist at U of L just to double check me if I was screwing it up, is the difference between individuals and families, right? Or households, census-wise households, right? And, for example, in rent-controlled cities, San Francisco is a perfect example, New York City's in there, and a few others, you see some of the worst, you see significantly underutilization of housing because somebody, and this happened to a friend of mine, it was in a rent-controlled apartment, it was himself in a 2-bedroom apartment, an apartment that could have housed a family of 4 or 5, right? And now it's just him because it's rent-controlled and he can afford it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's underutilized real estate. And one of the things the report was getting confused is, are we building housing, right, whatever type that is, for every single individual or for every single household? And I think they overcounted because they were looking at individuals versus households. Because if we're talking 30,000 households, I mean, now we're in the 100,000+. I mean, we'd be at such and that was just the certain levels of AMI. That wasn't even higher levels. We would be at such a deficit. We'd have we have a homelessness problem, but the spot check is not like thousands, right? It's in the tens or the hundreds, right? Depending on if you're talking about folks that are sheltered versus unsheltered and all this stuff. So, agreed, we need to do something. I'm not sure the numbers right though,
so I'll say that I do believe the numbers, and I believe the numbers just on my personal experience and my upbringing. Whether people are unhoused, which is worst case scenario, they don't have housing at all. They're in a shelter. We don't see them. They're in an encampment somewhere, deep in the woods somewhere. They're living in an overcrowded household, or they have housing and they just simply cannot afford that housing. So we're helping them with rent assistance. We're helping them go to the food bank. We're helping them with other needs, economic needs, that they might not necessarily need if they had housing that they could afford.
Yeah, and that one, I don't disagree at all about the categories. And to your point, in the data, we need to be super clear about each one of those groups, because the other one, and I'll use my own community, just so everybody understands, I'll gladly make fun of myself and my neighbors. When I was campaigning, and I live in Lake Forest, right? You'll walk up somehow, and this is a very upper middle income to upper income neighborhood, right? You walk up some houses, and that person's straight up house broke. But they voluntarily put themselves into a house broke situation.
That was one of my questions, because before redistricting, I was surprised to see that District 19 had the highest percentage of people who were cost burdened. Yep. And affordable housing is paying more than 30% of your income. But on this Greater Louisville Project study, it had people paying over 50% of their income. Right. So that's crazy you say that. People living above their means. People
are doing it, particularly in my district, for a lot of reasons. One of them, bluntly, is keeping up with the Joneses. My father died when he was young. He was 54. And right before he died, he looked me dead in the face and he was like, said something effective, don't care what everybody else is doing, essentially, right? Stop caring, right, what everybody else is doing. And he meant it, I knew, in the context of this concept of keeping up with the Joneses, feeling like you had to spend more, you had to have the nice car, you had to have the big house, you had to have all these things because your friends did, right? And so that's part of it. I've seen people who don't have a dollar to their name, and they're driving the most expensive Cadillac Escalade you've ever seen in your life, and I know they're worth nothing, right? They literally have a net worth of zero. And then on the flip side of that, there are people, and again, this is about getting really granular with the data, who are moving there because it's a safe neighborhood. I mean, relatively, it's a very safe neighborhood, District 19, and we're proud of that. And they will extend themselves to the hilt to be there, right? So that's something we want to look. I want every neighborhood to be safe, right? And so that people don't feel obligated to make themselves house poor in order to be in a safe neighborhood, right? So, yeah, there's some that are voluntarily doing it. There's some that are doing it because they don't believe, and it may be true, that they have no other options in order to be safe for their family and maybe get access to a different public school or whatever, due to how they're regionalizing that now and stuff. So that a couple of factors playing into it.
I have just a quick one just to wrap us up. Yep. We're both on this Louisville Metro Review Commission where we're trying to figure out how Louisville Metro government has worked, what went well, what do we need to improve over the past 2 decades. What's your number one hope for that commission? When it's all said and done, what do you hope comes out of it?
I'll answer it, but you better answer your own question on this one.
I do.
Okay, good. So mine is to have true, real, unimpeachable information about the differences between, really, I would almost put 3 categories, right? Urban services district, suburban cities, and then unincorporated areas, right? And what is the truth related to the money that they're spending versus the services that they're getting, so we can determine which model or models are the best for the public. Like that, to me, that's the number one goal. If we can define that and have real information about it, not guesses, not, then we can make truly informed decisions about how to organize this city moving forward. To me, that's the number one goal.
So mine is kind of like yours. I'm thinking about how can we, as Louisvillians, have a better city. And in some cases, there's some blockage, there's some gatekeeping happening in Frankfurt, decisions being made by some folks who don't even live here. So how do we kind of take the chains off, so to speak, to make Louisville the best it can be and give us the power to make decisions that we need to make for our constituents without folks who don't live here making those decisions for us. So I'm hoping this gives us a new voice in Frankfurt that we never had before. And I got a lot of hope for the process and collaborating with everybody, regardless of the political spectrum and regardless of party. What helps Louisvillians at large, and what do we need to change to 67C? What do we need to change in Frankfurt to make that happen?
Yeah. Awesome.
I took the pause. Are we good?
Yeah.
I know I say that and no, we can go for another hour. We can go for
say
another
we're
2
good.
hours. So I'm saying we're good. And I do not want to commit you guys to part 3, but I feel like each time you do this, you're just opening another door for another topic, which is also, I've said this at the end of each episode so far, hitting the mark of exactly what we wanted to do with this podcast, to have open communication and dialogue that triggers debate at this table, but outside of this building as well, in order to create fruitful and productive outcomes, not anger and animosity towards one another. So I really enjoyed this conversation again. So thanks, guys.
Appreciate it, Katrina.
Thank you.